December 1944. Hollywood wakes to a silence it still can't explain. Lupe Vélez is gone at 36, in a sudden, disputed ending that leaves more questions than answers. The papers move fast, the whispers move faster, and almost immediately her life begins to slip out of her own hands, turned into rumor, punchline, and lesson by people who never had to live inside her skin. Friends would later recall her generosity, her loyalty, and the money she sent home. Quiet truths, the headlines rarely printed for years. But before the legend, there was the climb. A young woman from Mexico who arrived with an accent the studios could sell and a spirit they couldn't easily tame. They crowned her the Mexican Spitfire, packaged her heat, and taught audiences to laugh at the very things that made her human. Was the fire really her nature, or the only role Hollywood would allow her to play? On screen, she was chaos with perfect timing. Off screen, she fought for pay, for respect, for space to be more than a stereotype. That kind of audacity, in an industry built to control women, especially women who weren't white, always comes with a price. And when the headlines needed a story, they found one. Her explosive romance, her public image, her private anxieties, all flattened into something consumable. Now, a century later, the most haunting part is not how she left, but what happened after. Why did a groundbreaking Latin star become easier to mock than to mourn? Which details are history, and which were stitched together to satisfy Hollywood's appetite for tragedy? Tonight we're not chasing shock, we're chasing clarity. Because if Lupe Vélez couldn't tell the world who she was, maybe we can finally ask the question that matters: who benefited from the version of her story that survived? Long before the headlines, before the myth, before the whispered stories that would follow her name for decades, Lupe Vélez was a determined young woman from San Luis Potosí who refused to accept the limits drawn around her life. Born into a strict household with military discipline, she learned early that obedience was expected but independence was instinct. When she left home to join traveling performers, she wasn't chasing scandal, she was chasing possibility. By the time she reached Los Angeles, she had little English and even fewer guarantees. What she did have was presence. Studios noticed immediately, not because they saw range or subtlety or long-term star potential, but because they saw something marketable, a foreign spark, an accent that could be amplified, a temperament that could be exaggerated. Hollywood did not ask who she wanted to become. It decided for her. She was branded the Mexican Spitfire, and the label stuck. Audiences loved the volatility on screen, the rapid-fire delivery, the dramatic reactions, the passionate outbursts carefully framed as comedy. The industry rewarded the stereotype because it was easy to sell. But what happens when a persona becomes a prison? When the character written for you begins to overwrite the person you actually are? In the early 1930s, she was not a minor player. She was bankable. She had contracts, leverage, and enough box office draw to negotiate her terms. That detail is often forgotten. It complicates the narrative. Because if she truly had power, then the story of her later decline cannot be explained by temperament alone. Something else shifted. As sound cinema evolved, as studio politics hardened, as leading roles narrowed into carefully curated images of glamour and restraint, Lupe's fire began to look less convenient. Her accent, once a novelty, was now a punchline. Her emotional range, once praised as dynamic, was described as excessive. Was she changing, or was Hollywood redefining what it wanted from women like her? She fought back in the only ways she could. She questioned scripts. She asked for stronger roles. She negotiated salary increases at a time when many actresses were expected to be grateful simply to remain employed. Each request, however reasonable, risked being interpreted as defiance. And in a system built on control, defiance is rarely forgiven. It is easy, decades later, to accept the studio narrative that she was difficult. But difficult compared to whom? Compared to actresses molded into silence? Compared to male stars who were allowed volatility without consequence? The word itself feels less like a description and more like a warning label. Outside the studio gates, the woman behind the persona told a different story. Friends described her as generous and fiercely loyal. She sent money home to her family in Mexico. She maintained close ties to her roots, even as Hollywood tried to package her identity into something exotic and consumable. That duality, public fire, private warmth, rarely made it into print. As the decade progressed, roles shifted, budgets tightened. The spark that once felt rebellious was reframed as risky. Was this the natural ebb of a career? Or was it the quiet sidelining of a woman who refused to shrink herself to fit the frame? By the late 1930s, the industry that had celebrated her intensity seemed less certain how to use it. And in that uncertainty lies the first real fracture in her story. Because once a star is defined by stereotype, escape becomes nearly impossible. The audience expects the caricature. The studio profits from it. And the person inside it must decide whether to comply or to resist. Lupe Vélez chose resistance more often than silence. And that choice, more than any headline, may have shaped everything that followed. By the time Lupe Vélez married Johnny Weissmuller in 1933, she already understood that Hollywood loved spectacle. What she may not have anticipated was how quickly her private life would become part of that spectacle. Weissmuller, the Olympic champion turned screen Tarzan, embodied physical strength and masculine confidence. Together, they looked like a studio publicist's dream: beauty, fame, and heat. But dreams, especially in Hollywood, are rarely left undisturbed. From the beginning, the press framed their relationship as combustible. Every disagreement became evidence of volatility. Every raised voice transformed into proof of passion too wild to control. The narrative was convenient. She was already branded the Mexican Spitfire. He was the athletic hero. It required little imagination for tabloids to cast them as fire and thunder colliding. But how much of that image was reality? And how much was expectation projected onto them? In an industry driven by publicity, marriage was never purely personal. It was branding. Studio columns dissected their movements, their silences, even the expressions captured in photographs. If she appeared animated, it confirmed the stereotype. If he seemed distant, it reinforced the drama. Private nuance had no place in a market that thrived on clarity and contrast. There were arguments, certainly. Two strong personalities rarely move through life without friction, yet friction does not equal catastrophe. Still, headlines preferred catastrophe. Stories of explosive confrontation circulated, sometimes without verification, sometimes amplified through repetition until they hardened into accepted truth. Over time, the distinction between lived experience and printed narrative blurred. What happens when the public begins to recognize a version of your marriage that feels more fictional than factual? How does a relationship survive when it is constantly watched, interpreted, and monetized? For Lupe, the answer seemed increasingly uncertain. Divorce followed after several turbulent years, and once again, the explanation was simplified. She was described as dramatic, emotional, excessive. Rarely was the conversation framed around incompatibility or mutual strain. Instead, the familiar image resurfaced: she was too much. The label that built her career now shadowed her personal life. Yet there is another way to read this chapter. Hollywood in the 1930s demanded containment from its women. Contained glamour, contained sexuality, contained emotion. Weissmuller's intensity could be reframed as virile. Lupe's intensity, by contrast, was recast as unstable. Was the difference rooted in behavior or in bias? The public appetite for drama rarely considers the cost to the subjects involved. When newspapers repeated exaggerated tales, they strengthened the caricature that studios had already constructed. The Spitfire persona became inseparable from her identity, even in moments that required vulnerability rather than performance. After the separation, roles began to narrow. The industry that once benefited from her vitality seemed hesitant to embrace it again. Was this simply the natural cycle of fame? Or did the very publicity that once elevated her now work quietly against her? In Hollywood, perception often outweighs fact, and once a narrative settles, it becomes difficult to rewrite. Through it all, she maintained connections to family and close friends. Those who knew her outside premieres and headlines described warmth, humor, and loyalty qualities that rarely make compelling tabloid copy. The gap between public persona and private character widened. Looking back, the marriage to Johnny Weissmuller is often remembered as spectacle rather than partnership. But spectacle is a story told from the outside. Inside it, there were likely moments of tenderness, frustration, ordinary human complexity details that never fit neatly into the columns of entertainment pages. So, the question remains, did the relationship fail because it was truly combustible, or because Hollywood needed it to burn brightly enough to keep audiences watching? And once the flames dimmed, was it easier to blame the fire than to examine who kept feeding it? Ambition has always been admired in Hollywood so long as it arrives in the right body, in the right tone, at the right volume. For Lupe Vélez, ambition did not whisper. It spoke clearly, confidently, and without apology. And in the studio system of the 1930s, that distinction mattered deeply. By the early years of her career, she had proven her box office value. She was not merely decorative, she was profitable. That profitability gave her leverage, and she used it. She negotiated contracts. She questioned scripts that flattened her into caricature. She requested stronger material and better compensation. None of these actions were unusual for major male stars. For a Latina actress already branded as volatile, however, they were interpreted differently. The label difficult began to circulate. It is a word that sounds neutral but carries consequences. Difficult can mean assertive. It can mean unwilling to be controlled. It can mean refusing to smile when told. In a system built on hierarchy, especially one that privileged white male authority, resistance often translated into reputation damage. Was she truly unreasonable or simply unwilling to remain silent? Hollywood at the time demanded a specific version of femininity. Glamorous? Yes. Sensual? Perhaps. But contained. Emotion was acceptable if it was elegant. Passion was welcome if it was polished. Lupe's energy did not always fit that mold. Her intensity, once celebrated as vibrant, began to be reframed as excessive. The same spark that had drawn audiences now made executives uneasy. There is a pattern in the way industries treat women who negotiate. A man who demands more is decisive. A woman who does the same is troublesome. Lupe's insistence on fair pay and meaningful roles did not align with expectations placed upon actresses of her background. She was meant to embody fire on cue, not wield influence behind the scenes. When she crossed that invisible boundary, the response was swift and subtle. Roles gradually shifted, budgets tightened, the scripts that reached her desk seemed narrower and safer. Was this coincidence? Was it simply the evolution of public taste? Or did the perception of her as uncontrollable make studios hesitant to invest in her long term? In Hollywood, perception often becomes reality long before facts can intervene. Yet those who worked closely with her sometimes described a different professional image, prepared, committed, aware of her value. She understood timing, understood audience reaction, understood the mechanics of performance. That awareness is not chaos. It is craft, but craft does not always protect against bias. It is tempting to interpret the arc of her career as inevitable, a bright beginning, a complicated middle, a fading spotlight. But inevitability is a comforting illusion. Careers are shaped by decisions made in rooms far from the camera. They are influenced by who is considered manageable, bankable, compliant. If Lupe Vélez was unwilling to be simplified, was the industry prepared to accommodate complexity? As the 1930s progressed, new faces emerged and new archetypes gained popularity. The exotic firebrand began to feel like yesterday's headline. Instead of expanding her range, studios leaned harder into the persona they had created. When that persona no longer fit the market, they seemed unsure how to reposition her. Reinvention requires patience and trust, qualities not always extended to women who challenge authority. So the question lingers, did her ambition accelerate her marginalization, or did it expose cracks already forming beneath the studio system? And if she had chosen silence over negotiation, compliance over confrontation? Would her career have endured longer, or simply faded quietly? Lupe Vélez refused to shrink herself to fit a frame drawn by others. In Hollywood, that refusal can be both strength and risk. The industry celebrates boldness on screen. Off-screen, it often prefers obedience. December 1944 arrived without warning, and with it came a moment that would permanently alter how Lupe Vélez would be remembered. She was 36 years old when she passed away in circumstances that quickly became the subject of speculation. The official details were brief, but the interpretations multiplied. Almost immediately, the space left by her absence was filled with narratives she no longer had the power to correct. At the time of her death, she was pregnant. That fact alone intensified public curiosity and moral judgment. Hollywood in the 1940s operated under rigid expectations for women, especially for women whose private lives did not align neatly with public ideals. Questions about the father circulated. Assumptions followed. Sympathy and scrutiny existed side by side, though scrutiny often proved louder. Without a definitive statement in her own voice, the story grew beyond verifiable facts. In the years that followed, more elaborate accounts appeared, some dramatic, some theatrical, some almost cinematic in their staging. Certain elements would later be challenged by researchers who suggested embellishment had overtaken evidence. Yet once an image takes hold in popular culture, it rarely releases its grip. Why do audiences gravitate toward the most sensational version of events? Is it discomfort with ambiguity, or a desire to assign meaning where uncertainty feels intolerable? In Lupe's case, the ambiguity seemed to invite invention. A complex life was compressed into a single, vivid anecdote repeated often enough to feel definitive. The tone of coverage revealed something deeper about Hollywood's relationship with its stars. When white actresses of similar stature passed under tragic circumstances, their legacies were often preserved through reverence. With Lupe, the narrative sometimes tilted toward caricature. The Spitfire persona resurfaced even in death, as if the industry needed her final chapter to match the character it had written for her years before. Yet those closest to her described a woman navigating emotional strain with determination rather than spectacle. The pressures surrounding reputation, career uncertainty, and personal upheaval were not abstract. They were immediate and heavy. Fame can amplify isolation, especially when public perception begins to overshadow private identity. Did the relentless scrutiny compound vulnerabilities already present? Or did the mythology that followed exaggerate struggles that were, at their core, human and ordinary? It is important to recognize the limits of what can be known. The absence of a clear personal account leaves room for humility. Some historians argue that aspects of the widely repeated version of her final hours lack solid documentation. Others contend that the truth may be less dramatic than the legend suggests. What remains consistent is that the story became larger than the woman. In the decades after her passing, references to Lupe occasionally surfaced in entertainment as dark humor or shorthand for excess. That shift from pioneering Latin star to cultural punchline reveals how easily narratives can be distorted when context disappears. Why was it easier to repeat an embellished anecdote than to honor a groundbreaking career? Her death marked not only the end of a life, but the beginning of a second existence in rumor. And rumor, once entrenched, often proves more durable than fact. The industry that had once shaped her image now seemed content to let that image evolve without correction. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this chapter is not the uncertainty itself, but the speed with which uncertainty became certainty in the public mind. When ambiguity is uncomfortable, stories rush to fill the void. The question remains, was her final chapter truly defined by what happened in December 1944, or by how that moment was retold for generations? And if silence allowed others to construct the narrative, what truths might still remain unheard? In the decades following her death, Lupe Vélez's legacy settled into an uneasy space between recognition and distortion. She was remembered, but not always accurately. Her name survived in film history, yet often accompanied by the same fiery shorthand that had defined her career. The nuance of her achievements, her early box office strength, Her contract negotiations, her refusal to remain silent, faded behind a simpler image. It is striking how frequently her story has been reduced to a cautionary tale. Instead of being framed as one of the first major Mexican actresses to command real visibility in Hollywood, she is sometimes remembered primarily for the controversy that surrounded her final chapter. Why does the ending eclipse the beginning? Why is it easier to repeat a dramatic anecdote than to examine the industry barriers she confronted? To understand her legacy, it is necessary to return to the context of her rise. In the early 1930s, Hollywood offered few leading roles to Latina performers. When they did appear, they were often confined to narrow archetypes: exotic, temperamental, ornamental. Lupe managed to transform those limitations into visibility. She carved out space where little existed before. That accomplishment alone complicates the caricature. Modern scholars have begun reassessing her place in cinematic history. Rather than viewing her as unstable or excessive, they examine the systemic constraints that shaped her options. They question the bias embedded in the word difficult. They revisit studio records, publicity strategies, and media coverage to separate fact from repetition. In doing so, they uncover a portrait far more layered than the myth suggests. Her personal warmth, described by friends and colleagues, rarely makes headlines. Yet those accounts matter. They challenge the assumption that public intensity equaled private chaos. They remind us that persona and person are not interchangeable. How many other actresses of the era were similarly simplified for the sake of narrative convenience? The conversation surrounding representation has also evolved. Today, audiences are more attuned to the ways stereotypes limit opportunity. Looking back, Lupe's career becomes an early example of how ethnicity could both elevate and confine. She was celebrated for her Latin fire, yet that same label prevented her from being seen as versatile. If she had been granted the full range afforded to white contemporaries, what might her filmography look like now? There is also the matter of dignity. When later entertainment referenced her in tones of irony or dark humor, it reinforced the imbalance between legacy and respect. Why did her memory become easier to trivialize? Was it because distance dulls empathy, or because the industry never fully relinquished control of her image? Reevaluation does not require romanticizing her life. It requires acknowledging complexity. She was ambitious, emotional, determined, and imperfect as all public figures are, but imperfection should not overshadow innovation. She entered an industry that did not expect women like her to negotiate power, and she did so anyway. As the years pass, history continues to rewrite itself. Each generation chooses which details to amplify and which to let fade. In Lupe Vélez's case, the opportunity now exists to rebalance the narrative, to move beyond caricature, to recognize both her achievements and the structural obstacles she faced. The enduring question is not whether she was fiery. She was. The question is whether that fire was ever allowed to burn on her own terms. And if Hollywood helped construct the myth that followed her, are we willing to dismantle it? Perhaps legacy is less about how a life ends, and more about who is permitted to define its meaning. For Lupe Vélez, that definition is still evolving. History has a quiet way of simplifying complicated lives. It prefers sharp outlines over blurred edges, headlines over context, myth over contradiction. In the case of Lupe Vélez, that simplification lasted decades. She was remembered as fire, as drama, as spectacle. But fire alone does not explain endurance. What remains, when the noise fades, is a woman who entered Hollywood at a time when few actresses from Mexico were given visibility at all. She negotiated, she resisted, she demanded, she refused to disappear quietly into the margins assigned to her. That defiance, whether celebrated or criticized, shaped her path as much as any role she played. Perhaps the most enduring injustice is not misunderstanding, but imbalance. The industry that built her image also benefited from narrowing it. When later generations inherited that version without questioning it, the caricature hardened. Yet history is not fixed. It can be revisited, reconsidered, rewritten. So what do we do with a legacy that exists somewhere between fact and folklore? We look closer. We separate documentation from repetition. We allow space for complexity where once there was only shorthand, and we ask whether the narrative served truth or convenience. Lupe Vélez was more than the label attached to her, more than the persona amplified for profit, more than the anecdote repeated for effect. She was a pioneer navigating an industry that both elevated and confined her. In the end, perhaps the real story is not about how she left the spotlight, but about how fiercely she stepped into it in the first place. And maybe the final question is this: when we remember her now, are we preserving a myth or finally meeting the woman behind it?